Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 18 stories for you, including the furniture man of the receding tide, the customs of the echo, the geometry of the whole, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The furniture man of the receding tide. I inherited my grandfather's farmhouse on the edge of a coastline that shouldn't exist. It sat in a valley where the ocean seemed to have been poured in like a basin, but it wasn't a typical sea. The water was heavy and thick, moving with a deliberate, honey-like slowness. On the day I moved in, the tide was high, pressing against the porch boards until they groaned. It was beautiful, but there was a strange pressure in the air, as if the water were holding its breath. My grandfather's diary had only one note about the sea. The great retreat is coming. Do not let it finish before you find your seat. I didn't understand what he meant until the first night. The water began to pull away from the shore with a low, rhythmic hum. It wasn't just moving toward the horizon, it was fleeing something in the deep. By the third day, the shoreline had retreated so far that the mud flats were exposed like the teeth of a giant, waiting beast. Then I heard the music. It started as a faint vibration in the floorboards, a lullaby, but the notes felt scrambled. The melody would rise to a peak and then suddenly drop into a low moan before returning to the start. It wasn't a song for a sleeping child, it was a song for something waking up. As the tide continued its relentless outward journey, the farmhouse began to feel smaller. The walls seemed to lean inward as the water pulled at the very foundations of the earth. On the fifth day, the water stopped moving entirely. It didn't just pause, it solidified into a vast, still expanse of turquoise glass, miles away from the house. That was when the furniture man emerged from the center of the dry seabed. He didn't walk so much as he assembled himself out of the silence. He was a towering, lopsided entity composed of mismatched pieces of timber and upholstery. His torso was the heavy seat of a velvet armchair, his left arm a crooked mahogany chair leg, and his right arm a smooth, curved banister from a grand staircase. His head was a cracked porcelain vase topped with a tassel of frayed silk. He didn't have skin. Instead, he had grain and weave. One leg was the sturdy foot of a dining table, while the other was a delicate, tapered spindle from a spinning wheel. Because his limbs were different heights, he moved with a jerky, rhythmic gait, swaying like a pendulum as he crossed the mud. He didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, he had 3 brass buttons arranged in a triangle where eyes should be, and a wide mouth made of a carved wooden tray. He began to move toward the house, his movements punctuated by the lullaby that seemed to emanate from his velvet chest. Each time he took a step, the song shifted order. Sleep now in the garden / wake beneath the moon / the tide has fled the shore / to find its silent room. It was always out of sequence, a jumble of sleep and wakefulness that made my skin prickle. By the 7th day, the water was so far away it looked like a distant ribbon of sapphire. The furniture man reached the porch. He didn't climb the stairs. He simply unfolded his mismatched limbs until his vase head rested on the top step. I stood in the doorway, clutching a chair, watching him. He didn't have any movement other than that slight sway. But as the sun began to set, he spoke in a voice that sounded like wood rubbing against wood. The tide is gone, he creaked, his tray mouth opening wide. And I am finally seated. He reached out with his banister arm and tapped the doorframe once. The house shuddered, and for a moment, the music stopped. Then, from deep beneath the floorboards, I heard a new sound. The furniture man wasn't just standing on the ground. He was pulling the farmhouse toward him like a magnet. He began to lean forward, his velvet seat pressing against my door. The tide would never return, and the furniture man had finally claimed his guest. The customs of the echo. To prepare the perfect echo, you must first find a room where time feels heavy. For this recipe, use a customs holding room after hours, a place designed for things waiting to be sorted. It should smell of floor wax and old paper, with fluorescent lights that hum in a low B-flat. You need a chair, a telephone with a coiled cord, and a steady supply of patience. First, sit in the center of the room and close your eyes until the silence begins to feel thick, like honey poured into a jar. Then, pick up the receiver. The phone will be silent at first, but as you wait, you will hear it. A single breath from the other end. It is not a human breath. It sounds like air passing through velvet. When you exhale, the echo responds instantly. But here is the secret ingredient of this recipe. Every time you hold your breath, the entity on the line pauses. It is waiting for you to give it permission to move. At first, the echoes are simple repeats of your own voice, but they arrive a fraction of a second too early. If you say, hello, the phone answers with hello before you have fully finished the word. It is as if the sound is rushing toward you from the future. As you continue to speak, the texture of the echo changes. It is no longer just your voice. It begins to take on a grainy, metallic quality, like a recording played through a mouthful of sand. You will notice that when the entity speaks your words back, the pitch is slightly deeper, and the vowels are rounded as if they were being shaped by something with a wide, wet mouth. The room begins to feel smaller as the echo grows more frequent. You start to realize that the entity isn't just repeating you, it is anticipating you. It knows what you are about to say before your vocal cords have even vibrated. When you whisper, "Who is there?" the phone replies with "Who is there?" a heartbeat before the thought leaves your brain. The air in the holding room grows colder, and the humming of the lights begins to sync with the rhythm of the echoes. You feel a weight in the room, a presence that isn't visible but occupies the space between your chair and the wall. It feels like the pressure of water pushing against your skin. Suddenly, the echo stops mimicking you entirely for 3 seconds. The silence is heavy enough to ache. Then, it speaks without being prompted. "I am almost here," the phone whispers in a voice that sounds like yours, but with a slight rasp, as if it were speaking through a throat lined with silk ribbons. You feel a sudden, sharp movement of air behind your left shoulder, though nothing moved. The echo responds again, this time even faster, nearly overlapping with your own heartbeat. "I am already here," it says, the sound coming not from the mouthpiece, but seemingly from the wall directly in front of your face. You realize that by inviting the echo to speak, you have invited the source to manifest. The room feels crowded now, as if a dozen invisible guests are leaning over your shoulder. Each time you try to take a breath, the phone catches it, holding it in suspense until you let it go. Finally, the entity makes its move. A shadow, not a person, but a distortion of light, stretches across the floor from beneath the table. It has the texture of hammered copper and moves with a fluid, rolling motion. It doesn't have a face, but rather a series of concentric ripples that pulse like a stone dropped into a still pond. It glides toward you, its edges shimmering. You hold your breath until your lungs burn, and the entity freezes perfectly still just inches from your nose. The phone gives one final, frantic burst of echoes, your own gasp, repeated 5 times in rapid succession, and then everything goes silent. The entity reaches out with a ripple that touches your forehead, feeling like a cool, wet thumbprint on warm porcelain. It pulls back into the shadows of the ceiling and vanishes into the rafters. To finish this recipe, you must stand up, leave the house, and keep walking until you can no longer hear the sound of your own shadow following you. The geometry of the hull. The pressure outside was a constant, heavy weight, but inside the hull of the Ethelgard, it was a tomb of silence. I descended into the wreck at 40 meters, my torch cutting a violent spear of light through the silt. The ship didn't just sit on the seabed, it seemed to swallow the surrounding water. I entered the main corridor first. It felt manageable, a straight stretch of rusted iron plating and peeling paint that measured roughly 20 paces from the bow gate to the galley door. I walked forward, my boots thudding against the sediment, noting the way the light danced off the jagged ribs of the frame. I reached the galley, turned around, and began the return journey. This is where the logic of the ocean failed me. The corridor did not measure 20 paces back. It stretched. It felt as though the walls were exhaling outward. Every step I took forward seemed to be consumed by a growing distance. I counted my strides, but for every 3 steps I took, the galley door drifted further away, as if it were retreating on invisible wheels. The ceiling grew higher, and the rusted ribs of the ship began to curve like the underside of a giant, prehistoric ribcage. I pushed forward, my heart hammering against my sternum. The silence was no longer empty. It felt thick, like velvet pressed against my ears. In the center of this elongated stretch, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't a creature or a shape with mass. It was a silhouette burned into the wall itself, as if the ship had remembered a movement that happened centuries ago and frozen it in place. It looked like a tall, hunched figure leaning forward, its torso elongated and its back slightly arched. It didn't move when I moved past it. It stayed anchored to the iron plate, a permanent stain of darkness. I stopped. "Who is there?" I whispered, my voice barely a ripple in the water. No answer came from the shadow. Yet, as I stood still, the corridor began to shudder. The walls didn't just move outward, they started to ripple like silk in a breeze. The shadow on the wall shifted slightly, not because it walked, but because the wall it lived on was warping around it. I felt a sudden, sharp pull in my gut. The galley door was now a tiny speck of light at the far end of a corridor that seemed to have doubled in length again. I began to run. The sensation of running was bizarre. It wasn't that I was moving faster. It was that the floor was lengthening beneath my feet as I stepped on it. The shadow stayed behind, though it felt like it was watching me. It grew larger as the corridor expanded, its hunched back stretching until it looked like a mountain peak of darkness against the rusted metal. I could hear a new sound now, a rhythmic, wet grinding, like two stones being rubbed together deep inside the ship's bones. The shadow began to lean further forward, its head dipping toward my path as I scrambled toward the exit. "Just get out," I muttered to myself. "It is just a stretch of metal." But the corridor wouldn't let me finish. Just as I reached the final 10 paces, the walls gave one last, violent heave. The hallway surged forward, collapsing inward on itself like a folding fan. I lunged for the bow gate, my fingers catching the rusted handle just as the ceiling began to descend. I burst through the door and into the open blue of the ocean. I hovered there for a moment, my bubbles rising in a silver chain. I looked back at the entrance. The corridor was gone, collapsed back into its original 20-pace dimensions. Or so it seemed from the outside. But as I drifted away, I realized something about the shadow. It hadn't been a permanent stain of the wall. As I watched the wreck sink further into the silt, I saw the shadow move 1 inch to the left on its own, independent of the metal it sat upon. It wasn't a memory of a figure. It was a figure waiting for the corridor to be long enough to finally step off the wall and into my space. And as it moved, the pressure outside felt less like water and more like a hand reaching out from the dark, closing its fingers around me. The Curator's Burden, the silhouette of the threshold. I have spent my life cataloging the debris of the dead, yet there is one item in my collection that remains stubbornly unlisted for sale. It is not a painting or a statue, but a memory and a physical space, sourced from the Salttooth Lighthouse on a speck of land so small it barely registers on a nautical chart. Most people prefer to sell their relics, but this lighthouse demands a sacrifice of permanence. To own it is to house the cave of respiration. For decades, I lived within its stone ribs, learning the peculiar rhythm of the island's breath. The lighthouse itself was a sturdy thing of granite and lime, but the cave at its base was where the true magic, or malice, resided. It was a narrow, jagged slit in the coastline, always smelling of brine and ancient, pulverized limestone. The most unsettling property of the cave is its pulse. Whenever I stood perfectly still within its mouth, the air would begin to exhale. It wasn't a draft, it was a heavy, humid warmth that pushed against my skin, as if the cave were a set of massive lungs filling with steam. On the first night, I sat on a smooth rock and closed my eyes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic thrum of waves. Then, the heat arrived. It surged forward in a steady tide, smelling faintly of wet earth and crushed violets. It felt as though something massive was exhaling against my forehead. I opened my eyes and saw nothing but shadows, yet the sensation persisted. The next night, the warmth became more intentional. It didn't just push, it pulsed. One heavy exhale followed by a momentary pause, then another. It felt like a giant ribcage expanding in the dark. By the third day, the air began to carry a texture. It was thick, almost velvety, clinging to my hair and dampening my clothes. I realized then that the cave wasn't just reacting to my stillness, it was watching me. In that state of motionlessness, I became the focus of the cave's attention. The heat intensified until it felt like a physical weight, pressing me into the stone floor. That was when the first silhouette appeared. It didn't emerge from the shadows in a traditional sense. It manifested as an architectural certainty. At the far end of the cave, where there should have been only rough rock, a doorway appeared. It wasn't made of wood or iron. It was a rectangle of perfect, velvet black void. Within that void stood the inhabitant. It didn't have fur or feathers. Its body was composed of layered, translucent membranes, like the underside of a mushroom, but shimmering with an iridescent oil sheen. Instead of a face, it possessed a cluster of vibrating filaments that resembled the crown of a sea anemone. It had no limbs in the traditional sense, only undulating ribbons of muscle that allowed it to ripple across the ground. When I finally spoke into the silence, my voice felt like a pebble dropped into deep water. "Are you the one who breathes?" I whispered. The filaments shivered, and the cave exhaled a long, mournful sigh of steam. The creature did not walk toward me. It simply stepped down from its doorway, a threshold it carried with it like a personal shadow, and glided across the floor. It moved with a liquid grace, its ribbons folding over one another like a deck of cards being shuffled by an invisible hand. As it approached, the warmth became stifling, nearly searing. It stopped inches from my chest, and I could feel the vibration of its filaments humming against my ribs. It wasn't just a creature, it was a traveler between dimensions, using the cave as its lungs and the doorway as its gateway. I reached out to touch one of its shimmering membranes, but before my skin met its surface, the air suddenly turned freezing. The heat vanished instantly. The filaments flared into a brilliant, bioluminescent amber, and the creature let out a sharp, clicking sound that echoed off the walls like breaking glass. Then it didn't just move, it folded. It collapsed inward, shrinking until it was no larger than a walnut. Before sliding back into its doorway, with a final, violent pulse of heat, the door vanished. The cave returned to its state of silent, cold stone. I sat in the dark for an hour, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally stood up and took a step forward, the warmth retreated as if startled. It was only when I began to move again that the creature remained dormant, waiting for the next time I would dare to be still enough to notice it. The Log of the 11th Hour. Entry 1. The salt air is heavy tonight. I have spent 3 months on this rock, tending to a light that cuts through the mist like a steady blade. My job is simple: keep the wick trimmed and the oil flowing. Yet, as the tide retreats, the silence of the tower feels heavier than the storm. It is a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. Entry 4. Something has entered the lantern room. It did not arrive by boat or by wing. It simply appeared in the corner, an anomaly of geometry. It looks like a doorway that has lost its frame, a vertical rectangle of absolute nothingness where the stone wall should be. It isn't a hole, it is a lack of existence. When I look into it, my eyes ache as if they are trying to focus on a distant mountain that isn't there. It is perfectly rectangular, but its edges seem to fray at the bottom like wet velvet. Entry 9. The absence has begun to hum. Not a sound, exactly, but a vibration in my teeth. It remains fixed in the corner of the room, yet today I notice something peculiar about the shadows. They no longer fall away from the light source. Instead, they lean toward the doorway-shaped void, as if being pulled into its mouth by an invisible tide. Entry 12. The counting is failing. I woke this morning to find that my clock had stopped at 3 hours past midnight, even though the sun was high in the sky. When I tried to restart it, the gears groaned and refused to move. The dark hours are stretching. I realized then that time inside the tower is no longer linear. It is being swallowed by the void. Entry 15. Tonight, the breathing began. It started as a soft pulse in the air, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation that didn't belong to me or the wind. At first, I thought it was the lighthouse itself sighing. Then I realized the rhythm was perfect. Every time my lungs expanded, the void exhaled. Every time I took a breath, the absence inhaled. It was a synchronization of life and nothingness. Entry 18. I spent an hour sitting perfectly still, watching the doorway-shaped vacancy. I tried to trick it by holding my breath for 10 seconds. The void waited. Then it exhaled a long, shuddering breath that smelled of old ozone and wet stone. It was reacting to me. It wasn't just a hole in the wall. It was an ear waiting to hear my heartbeat. Entry 21. I decided to reach out today. I extended my hand toward the void. My fingers didn't disappear into it like they would into water. Instead, they felt as though they were being smoothed over by a surface that wasn't quite solid and wasn't quite liquid. It was a texture of almost. As my hand entered the void, the breathing became frantic. It began to pace itself with my pulse, a rapid-fire sequence of inhales that made the very walls of the tower vibrate. Entry 24. The voice arrived during the storm. It wasn't a sound from a throat. It was a vibration translated into meaning. From the center of the void came a crackle, like ice breaking on a pond. "Is it time?" it asked. My own voice surprised me, coming from my lips in perfect harmony with the void's response. I didn't speak until it prompted me to. It is waiting for the count to reach 0. Entry 27. The hours are collapsing. Yesterday, I lived through 4 days of Tuesday. Today, the sun rose and set 6 times in a single minute. The lighthouse is shrinking. Or perhaps the void is expanding. The doorway-shaped absence now occupies half the room. It no longer looks like a hole. It looks like a mouth that has forgotten to close. Entry 30. I can no longer tell where my body ends and the void begins. When I breathe, the void breathes with such force that my chest feels pulled outward by an invisible hook. The counting of the dark hours is nearly finished. I sat in the center of the lantern room today and watched the last of the light being sucked into the rectangle of nothing. And Entry 31, it happened. The final breath was taken simultaneously by us both, a deep, cavernous gulp that pulled the air from my lungs and the stone from the walls. I am no longer holding the lighthouse. The void is holding me. I can feel its edges pressing against my ribs, hungry for more. I looked into the doorway one last time before the light went out completely and realized it wasn't a hole in the wall at all, but an opening into what happens after the world forgets to continue. The Handshake of the Highlands. I am recording this because I cannot trust my own eyes to remember what is happening in the periphery. If you are watching this, imagine that I am sitting in the middle of a night coach, suspended on a series of steep switchbacks as we climb into the high mountains. The air outside is thick and heavy, smelling of whetstone and pine needles. Inside, there are only 4 other passengers, all huddled in their coats, but for me, it feels like there is an invisible weight pressing against my shoulders from the darkness, just beyond the reach of the flickering overhead bulbs. My neighbor, the person sitting directly opposite me, is a peculiar specimen. They moved into this seat exactly 3 minutes ago, arriving as if they had been waiting in the shadows for the train to hit this specific curve. What makes them unsettling isn't their posture or their clothes. It is the fact that they are wearing the face of the last tenant who sat here. When I boarded, the seat was occupied by an old man with a deep scar across his chin and a heavy brow. Now, my neighbor has that exact same scar and those identical brows, but the rest of their head is different. Their skin isn't quite smooth. It looks like textured parchment paper that hasn't been fully smoothed out by a human hand. They don't have hair. Instead, their scalp is covered in tiny, iridescent scales that shimmer like oil on water whenever they move. And then there are the eyes, not round pupils, but rectangular slits that flicker with a soft amber light. The neighbor doesn't speak with words. Every time they open their mouth to communicate, it emits the distinct, mechanical shriek of a dial-up modem attempting to connect to a server. It is a rhythmic series of chirps, hums, and static bursts, asterisk EER and CHHKKSHHHHH star. They aren't just making noise, they are negotiating. Every time I blink, the sound changes pitch slightly, as if they are searching for the right frequency to latch onto my consciousness. The train jolts over a sharp rock, and the neighbor leans forward. Their jaw unhinges further than a human's should, stretching almost horizontally. EENTSHHHH, they pulse. It feels like a question. I find myself answering without thinking, my own voice feeling small in the cavernous mountain air. Who are you? I whisper. The neighbor responds with a rapid-fire burst of static, asterisk BRRRP cluck SHHHH star. Their face ripples. For a moment, the scar on their chin twitches, and for a split second, it looks like the old man's mouth is trying to form my name through the neighbor's new skin. The coach begins to tilt at a precarious angle as we hit a hairpin turn. I feel a sudden draft of cold air from the aisle, even though there is no open window. I see something move in the corner of my vision, something just off camera. It isn't the neighbor. It's a secondary shape, a looming silhouette that seems to be woven into the very fabric of the train car. It has no distinct limbs, appearing more like a floating curtain of velvet lace, swaying in a wind we cannot feel. This lace-like entity is hovering just behind the neighbor, its edges fraying and fraying as it expands. It isn't watching me, it is feeding on the connection. The neighbor's face begins to distort again. The parchment skin starts to fold like an accordion. Work-like they shriek, their rectangular eyes widening until they take up almost the entire face. The sound is louder now, vibrating in my chest cavity, a physical thrumming that makes my teeth ache. It's trying to finish the handshake. They are trying to sync my heartbeat with their own internal clock. I can feel my pulse slowing down, matching the steady, rhythmic CHCHK of their vocalizations. The train reaches the highest peak and levels out for a brief, breathless second. Silence falls over the coach, but it isn't true silence. It's the pregnant pause between two notes. In that moment, the neighbor's face suddenly snaps into focus. The old man's scar is gone. The parchment skin has smoothed over completely. They are no longer wearing a tenant's face. They have stolen it entirely, and now it is beginning to crack like dry mud. I reach out a trembling hand to touch their shoulder, but before my fingers can make contact, the neighbor opens their mouth one last time for a final, triumphant connection. SHHHHHHH. The sound isn't just heard, it's felt as a vacuum of pressure that pulls the air from my lungs. My hand touches their skin, and instead of feeling flesh, I feel a sudden, sharp sensation of electricity. The neighbor's face cracks wide open down the middle, revealing not teeth or a tongue, but a glowing, spinning core of pure data. And then, they finally move. They lean in until their forehead touches mine, and I hear a faint, wet click as my own face begins to stretch and smooth out to accommodate theirs. The void of the Whiteout. Draft 1, it is 3 a.m. The blizzard has finally erased the horizon, turning the glacier into a featureless bowl of milk and ice. I am sitting in the center of Tent 4, huddled under 3 wool blankets. My breath comes out in steady plumes, each one vanishing almost instantly into the freezing air. Outside, the wind is a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrates against the nylon walls. It feels as though the world has shrunk down to this small, fabric square, yet I can't shake the feeling that something is pressing against the exterior skin of the tent, waiting for an invitation. Draft 2. A sound just broke through the hum, a sharp, rhythmic clicking from outside the flap. It isn't the crack of shifting ice or the whistle of wind. It sounds like teeth meeting together, but with a hollow resonance. I am holding my breath now, trying to determine if it was a singular event or a pattern. The temperature has dropped another 5 degrees, and the frost is beginning to bloom in crystalline patterns across the ceiling above my head. Draft 3. Someone just knocked. Not a hand on the fabric, but a distinct, deliberate tap against the heavy pole supporting the roof. It was perfectly timed, 3 beats in quick succession. I am currently gripping my thermal mug so hard my knuckles are white. I haven't moved from my sleeping bag yet because I'm afraid that movement will signal my presence to whatever is hovering just inches away. Draft 4. I finally looked up toward the flap. For a split second, a silhouette appeared, a jagged outline against the snow. It isn't a solid thing. It looks like a hole cut into reality. It has no skin or fur, but rather a texture like velvet soot, and its edges are slightly blurred as if it's still vibrating. It doesn't have a face in the traditional sense, but there is a slight indentation where a nose might be, and 3 small ridges along its crown that catch the dim lantern light. Draft 5. I reached out my hand to touch the flap, and the thing reacted instantly. It didn't walk toward me. It moved by collapsing inward, shrinking slightly as if it were trying to occupy less space. Then, a voice drifted in. It wasn't a human voice, but a perfect mimicry of mine. You are reaching out your hand now, it whispered. My heart nearly stopped. The pitch was identical to my own, but the cadence was slightly off, more rhythmic than natural. Draft 6. I pulled my hand back and froze. It spoke again, almost before the echo died away. You were pulling your hand back in shock because you realized I am not just watching you, but recording you. The thing is moving now. It's gliding across the floor of the tent, its velvet suit body trailing a faint scent of ozone and old paper. It doesn't have feet. It moves like a spill of ink expanding across a white page. Draft 7. It stopped exactly 3 feet in front of my face. I can see the ridges on its crown pulsing with a soft, amber light. The void shape is changing slightly, stretching vertically until it towers over me. You are staring at my crown, it murmured, and the sound seemed to come from inside my own head rather than the air between us. You are wondering if I am made of shadows, or if I am simply the place where the light forgot to land. Draft 8. It began to vibrate faster, a hum that makes the loose threads of my blankets dance. Then it spoke again, its voice becoming more layered, as if several versions of me were speaking at once. You are feeling the hair on your arms stand up because you realize I am beginning to mirror your heartbeat. I can see it now, the velvet soot is rippling like water. It's not just a shape, it's a vessel. It's holding every movement, every breath, and every twitch of my muscles in its silent, empty core. Draft 9. It leaned forward, the ridges on its head glowing brighter until they were almost blinding. You are realizing that I am not an inhabitant of this glacier, it whispered, the voice now a low, resonant thrum. I am the space you left behind when you walked into this tent. The shape expanded one last time, nearly touching my forehead, its velvet surface feeling like cool silk against my skin. End Draft 10. It spoke the final words in a voice that was no longer mine, but a perfect, terrifying synthesis of us both. You are closing your eyes now because you know that when you open them, I will have taken your place. I blinked, and for a heartbeat, the tent was empty. When my vision cleared, the velvet soot shape was gone, but there was a lingering warmth in the air where it had been, and a new, perfectly shaped silhouette stood in the center of the room, waiting for me to move so that it could finally begin its turn. The graduation of the Uncounted. To my fellow graduates, look at us. We are gathered here in this small box of steel and light, caught in the transition between what we were and what we will become. There is a particular irony in graduating today, isn't there? Usually, a graduation implies a completion, a finality where every seat is filled and every student is accounted for. But as I stand before you, in this stalled elevator suspended between the 3rd and 4th floors of the St. Jude wing, I realize that some of us are missing. I can feel your presence, even if the space beside you feels empty. We have been trapped here since 3:04 a.m., watching the hospital corridor outside turn into a blur of fluorescent white. At first, we were just students in heavy robes, adjusting our caps and whispering about the future. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the silence began to change. It stopped being the silence of waiting and became the silence of listening. I noticed it first with my own sleeve. The wool of my graduation gown, which fit me perfectly this morning, began to feel different. It started to sag at the shoulder, as if something heavier than a human arm were resting inside the fabric. Then, the texture changed. Where my elbow used to crease sharply, the cloth now rippled with a series of small, rhythmic bumps, like the vertebrae of a hidden spine. I looked down and realized that while I hadn't moved, my clothes had begun to adapt to a new occupant. My gown wasn't just hanging on me anymore. It was being stretched by a shape that lacked a name. It moved with a deer-gaited grace, a strange, leaping gait that felt both fluid and slightly jerky. Every time the elevator gave a tiny shudder, I felt the weight shift. I realized then that we were not alone in this box. There is something else here, inhabiting the folds of our garments. It does not have a face in the traditional sense, but it has a presence. It is a creature of transitions. It moves only when we are not looking at it directly, and more importantly, it moves only when we blink. Every time my eyelids meet, the shape repositioned itself. When I opened them, it was an inch closer to my chest, its velvet soft fur pressing against my ribs. Is anyone there? I whispered into the hum of the stalled motor. The response wasn't a voice, but a subtle tug on my collar. My gown didn't just fit me anymore. It was becoming tight around my waist, as if a narrow ribcage were expanding beneath the wool. I felt a warmth radiating from my left side, a steady heat that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. It wasn't heavy enough to crush me, but it was substantial enough to pull my posture into a slight lean toward the corner. I realized then why some of our seats feel empty. The students who were here at 8 a.m. haven't disappeared. They have simply been integrated. They're being worn by the derogated shape. It doesn't walk on the floor, it walks through us. By the time we reached the halfway mark of our vigil, my gown was no longer a garment, it was a nest. The fabric rippled as the entity stretched its neck, a curved, elegant length that emerged from my shoulder like a rising mast. It didn't have fur in the way a dog does. It had a coat of iridescent scales that felt like polished river stones. Each time I blinked, the scales shifted color, moving from deep moss green to a bruised plum. "You are becoming part of the ceremony," I said to the empty space beside me. My voice sounded hollow, as if it were being filtered through a mouthful of water. The entity reached out, not with fingers, but with a wide, flat palm that felt like damp suede. It pressed against my sternum and pulled. For a moment, the elevator lights flickered, and I felt my own bones stretch to accommodate its width. My gown was now stretched so taut across my back that it looked like the skin of a drum. We were no longer just students. We were the hosts for the Uncounted. It moved with a sudden, elegant hop, its body pivoting within my clothes as if it were dancing in a room larger than this tiny box. I could feel its breath, not on my face, but against the inside of my collarbone. It was a cool, mini draft that smelled of crushed pine needles. We're almost at our destination now. The elevator is beginning to groan, preparing to move again. But as we prepare for the final floor, I realize the ultimate truth of our graduation. The entity isn't just visiting us, it is replacing the spaces we left behind. When the doors finally open and we step out into the hallway, we will be recognized not by our faces, but by the way our clothes perfectly frame the magnificent, strange shape that now calls us home. As I stepped forward, the weight of the entity shifted one last time, pulling my gown into a perfect, smooth curve as if it were finally settled. My own shadow on the hospital floor was no longer a human silhouette, but showed a long, elegant neck and two pointed ears protruding from my head. The architecture of the Grin. I've told you all before that some places don't just hold memories, they absorb your very anatomy. If you want to believe me, look at my hands, they still feel heavy, as if they belong to someone who lived a century before I was born. It happened during the Great Salt Flat Trek. We had wandered out so far that the horizon lost its definition, becoming a seamless seam between a white ground and a violet sky. There were no trees to break the wind, no hills to catch our breath. Just the vast, cracked crust of salt stretching until your vision felt like it was being pulled in 4 directions at once. By the 3rd hour of walking, the silence began to feel heavy, almost tactile, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. That was when I first noticed the dimness. It didn't appear all at once. At first, it was just a smudge on the edge of my vision, a pocket of shadow that didn't behave like a regular shadow. It wasn't cast by me or any object. It simply existed, pooling in the air like spilled ink that hadn't quite dried. As I walked, I felt a strange tugging sensation in my joints, a subtle realignment of my skeleton. My humerus bone felt an inch longer. My ribs seemed to shift slightly outward. It was as if my body were being resculpted by an invisible hand. Then it moved toward me. The dimness coalesced into a shape, a towering, lanky thing that moved with the fluid grace of a ribbon falling through water. It didn't have eyes in the traditional sense. Instead, its face was dominated by a massive, wide-reaching smile. But this wasn't a joyful expression. The smile was a physical crater, and within its deep creases sat pools of pure dimness. These weren't just dark spots. They were voids that seemed to drink the light from my lantern. Every time the entity moved, those shadows would ripple like water in a basin. I stopped walking because my legs felt different. My knees didn't just bend, they pivoted with a satisfying, heavy click that sounded like stone grinding against stone. I looked up at the entity and whispered, "Are you taking me?" The dimness responded not with a voice, but by widening its grin until the shadows in its cheeks pulsed. It leaned down, and I felt the sensation of my own skin beginning to stretch. My shoulders broadened, and my spine elongated with a series of soft pups. I wasn't just watching it, I was merging with it. By the time the sun began to threaten the horizon, the transformation was accelerating. The dimness didn't just stand near me anymore. It seemed to be pouring into my pores. My own face began to ache as if my muscles were trying to find a new way to sit. I could feel my jaw stretching wide, the corners of my mouth pulling toward my ears. When I tried to speak again, my voice came out with a slight metallic resonance, like a bell ringing underwater. "I can feel your weight," I said, and as I spoke, the entity mimicked the movement perfectly. It was no longer just an observer, it was a blueprint. My ribs expanded to accommodate its internal geometry. My feet grew wider, rooting me into the salt crust as if my heels were becoming part of the earth itself. The dimness was settling into my bones, filling the marrow with its own quiet substance. The most unsettling part wasn't the physical change, but the way it felt to lose my original self. My memories began to blur, replaced by the entity's sensations, the feeling of being a shadow in a fold, the taste of a silent room. I could feel my humerus bone becoming denser, more reliable. My fingers grew thick and sturdy, losing their delicate tips as they became blunt instruments of the dimness. As we reached the center of the flats, the entity finally folded itself into me completely. There was no sudden explosion of light or sound, just a final, deep sigh that vibrated through my chest. The tall, lanky shape vanished, leaving only me standing in the middle of the white waste. I was taller now, heavier, and my movements were deliberate and slow. I reached up to touch my face. My skin felt cooler, smoother. When I pulled my hand away, I realized that while the entity was gone, its signature remained. It had left its house, but it had kept my body as its new home. I walked back toward the camp, every step feeling like a deliberate choice of a creature that was still learning how to breathe. I sat by our fire that night and watched the flames. My friends noticed the change immediately, the way I moved, the way my shadow seemed just a bit deeper than it should be. They asked if I felt different, and I looked at them with my new, wide expression. "It feels like I'm still growing," I replied. But as the fire died down and the silence returned, I realized that while I had inherited its bones, I hadn't quite mastered its purpose yet. My smile stayed wide even when I wasn't happy, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, I can feel my ribs expanding just a little bit more, waiting for the next piece of me to be replaced. The Ledger of Lost Breath. I sat in the velvet armchair, my hands trembling slightly as I held the notebook. In our weekly support group for chronic anomalies, the room was usually filled with the hum of hushed voices and the scent of peppermint tea. Tonight, however, there was a heavy, expectant stillness. Everyone turned toward me as I prepared to share my discovery from the old Victorian house I moved into last month. The nursery was the strangest room in the building. It sat at the end of a drafty hallway, half repainted in a dusty sage green while the other half remained the original, peeling cream. It felt like a room caught between two different eras of thought. It was there, tucked under a heavy oak cradle that had no wheels, that I found the diary. At first, I assumed it belonged to the previous owner, a woman who lived in the house during the late 1800s. But as I opened the first page, my breath hitched. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my own script, the specific slant of my T's, the way my E's looped backward, the exact pressure of the pen against the paper. Yet, I had never written a single word in it before moving in. The entries were chronological, but they didn't describe my life. They described a life that was perfectly consistent yet entirely alien to my own memories. Tuesday, the salt tasted like copper today, one entry read. I have never associated salt with copper. Wednesday, I woke up with the sound of bells under my pillow. There were no bells under my pillows when I woke up, but as I read the line, a faint, metallic ringing began to echo in the back of my skull. As I continued reading, the middle of the diary became more frantic. The handwriting stayed mine, but the content grew more specific, more intimate. Thursday, the shadow in the corner finally learned to hum. That night, a shadow did indeed appear in the corner of the nursery, and it emitted a low, vibrating drone that made the floorboards shudder. It was as if the diary wasn't just recording a life, it was drafting one into existence while I watched. Then came the moment of true terror. On page 42, the ink began to behave strangely. Instead of staying within the lines of the paper, the words started to seep downward like wet paint. From the bottom edge of the page, a thin strip of parchment began to unspool. It wasn't just paper, it was growing. A texture emerged from the tail of the ink, a physical extension of the diary itself. It looked like a long, continuous receipt, winding out across the floor like a ribbon of history. As I watched, the receipt didn't just lay flat, it began to thicken and gain substance. With every new line of text that appeared in my handwriting, an inch of body materialized from the paper. It wasn't a ghost or a solid statue. It was a creature made of woven ink and textured parchment. It had a torso composed of flowing cursive and limbs that looked like folded ribbons of heavy cardstock. Its head was a large, elegant S, curving over a face that seemed to be etched into the grain of the page. The entity didn't move with grace. It moved with a rhythmic, mechanical unfolding. It stood at the foot of my chair, its body unspooling from the diary as if it were being printed in real time. "Who are you?" I whispered, the words feeling heavy in the quiet room. The creature didn't speak with a mouth. Instead, the ink on its chest rippled, and a sound like rustling paper filled the air. It shifted closer, its body growing longer by another 3 inches as it reached out to touch my hand. Its skin felt like high-quality vellum, smooth, but slightly porous. The diary's pages began to flip rapidly on their own, fueled by some invisible wind. The text flew across the pages. Friday, it finally touched me. As soon as the ink dried, the creature's body surged forward, its parchment chest expanding until it pressed against my ribs. I felt a strange sensation of being pulled into the paper, as if my own skin were becoming slightly more fibrous. I realized then that this wasn't just a record of life, it was a trade. For every moment the diary recorded in my handwriting, something of my own reality was being consumed to build its physical form. The more I read about its world, the less I felt like a part of my own. The group members sat in stunned silence, watching as the creature reached for the final page. It grew one last time, its tail curling around my feet like a dry ribbon of memory. It stood tall, perfectly still, its parchment face oriented toward mine. The ink on its body began to glow with a soft, dull light. The diary fell shut with a resounding thud, the finality of the sound echoing off the walls. I looked at my hand, where the creature had touched me. My skin was no longer smooth. It had taken on the faint, raised texture of a pressed letter. The entity remained there, a permanent resident of the nursery, waiting for the next word to be written. I looked down at the very last line I had read, which now sat in the center of the page. Saturday, I took its place. The melody of the wardrobe. The high-altitude silence of the mountaintop observatory was usually my sanctuary. At 3 a.m, the world below was a muffled void, leaving only the hum of the telescope's rotating gears and the rhythmic breathing of my own lungs. I lived in the dome alone, surrounded by brass instruments and the vast, cold emptiness of the cosmos. But for the last 4 nights, that silence had been punctured by something impossible. It began as a faint, tinny melody, the jingle of a classic ice cream truck, those 3 cheerful notes rising from the floorboards. There were no trucks on this peak, and certainly none so close to my chair. On Monday, the music arrived at the far corner of the room, near the heavy oak closet door that housed my spare linens. It was a muffled tune, as if played through a thick velvet curtain. On Tuesday, it moved 6 feet closer. By Wednesday, it sat right beside my desk. Each night, I would sit with my notebook and watch the closet door. I told myself it was an acoustic trick of the mountain air, a lingering echo trapped in the dome's curvature. But then came Thursday, when the jingle reached my chair. It wasn't just moving, it was becoming sharper, more melodic, as if the source were getting larger. I decided to investigate the closet on Friday. I had noticed that whenever I moved a pile of wool sweaters, the door would swing shut with a heavy, satisfying thud. That night, after the jingle played its final note right at my elbow, I grabbed a pen and a small slip of paper. On the wall hung a fading missing person flyer, a portrait of a young girl named Alara who had vanished from the valley 2 years ago. Her face was half erased by time, her hair a blur of sepia. I taped my first note to her forehead. "Who is singing?" I wrote. That night, the jingle played at my shoulder. Saturday brought a new note. "Are you hungry?" The music was now so close it felt like someone was humming directly into my ear canal. On Sunday, the melody became frantic, skipping notes and vibrating with an intensity that made the glass of the telescope rattle. I sat in total darkness, watching the closet door. Every time it creaked shut, I heard a metallic scrape, like metal sliding over wood. It was the sound of something unfolding. Monday night was different. The jingle didn't just play, it screamed its 3 notes with such clarity that I could hear the imaginary bell chime. The music stopped abruptly after the final note. In the sudden vacuum of silence, I heard a heavy, wet slide from inside the closet. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped moth. I opened the door. There was no person. Instead, hanging from the center hook was a creature made entirely of coat hangers. It wasn't just a pile, it was a skeletal architecture of wire and wood. These weren't ordinary hangers, they were organic, interconnected by smooth, jointed segments. The central piece was a heavy, curved wooden hanger that served as a torso, while hundreds of wire hooks branched out like ribs or hair. It had no face, only a series of interlocking loops at the top that mimicked a crown. It was currently hunched in a ball, but as I watched, it unbent itself. A segment of wire elongated by an inch, then another. The sound was a rhythmic click-clack. It didn't move like a living animal. It moved like a folding map being opened in slow motion. I reached out to touch it. As my hand neared, the creature shuddered. It unbent another inch, its wire ribs expanding outward until they nearly touched the walls of the closet. The jingle played again, but this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was vibrating through the hangers themselves. Tuesday night, I didn't wait for it to move. I stayed awake, watching the door. Every time I blinked, the creature unbent another inch. By midnight, it had stretched so far that its wire arms were reaching out of the closet, stretching toward me like a blooming flower made of chrome. Wednesday was the final night. The music was no longer 3 notes, it was a constant, shimmering trill that filled every corner of the dome. I sat perfectly still as the creature underwent its final expansion. It moved with a sudden, fluid grace, its joints snapping into place. One by one, the hangers unbent until they were fully extended, forming a sprawling, metallic web that occupied nearly half the room. It reached out for me, a dozen wire hooks trembling at the tips. I realized then that it wasn't just growing, it was seeking to occupy my space. On Thursday morning, I woke up to find the closet door wide open. The creature was no longer in the closet. It had fully unbent itself into a sprawling, shimmering canopy of wire and wood that covered the ceiling like a frozen spiderweb. And there, at the very center of the web, directly above my head, sat one single, perfect hanger, curved perfectly to fit the shape of a human skull. I stood up to move it, but I stopped when I saw the shadow it cast on the floor. It wasn't just a shadow of a hanger, it was a shadow of a face with a mouth wide open as if waiting for me to step inside. The frame between frames. Subject: Incident Report 402-B. Location: the houseboat afloat. Date: October 14th. I am writing this while the engine is off, and the water is as flat as a sheet of hammered lead. It started on Tuesday. My twins, Leo and Silas, were sitting at the small wooden table in the galley. They're identical in every measurable way, same height, same messy copper hair, same crooked smiles. I thought they were perfect copies until the lake became perfectly still. When the water stopped rippling, the houseboat felt like it was trapped in a vacuum of silence. That is when I noticed the first twitch. Leo reached for a piece of bread, and his hand didn't just move, it blurred. For a fraction of a second, his palm looked wider than his wrist, as if it were occupying 2 places at once. It wasn't a smudge of movement like a fast runner, it was a physical layering, like a photograph where the shutter stayed open a millisecond too long. I blinked, and he was back to normal. Then Silas moved. He reached for his water glass, and his elbow seemed to shudder into a jagged, serrated shape that flickered out of existence before I could name it. I looked at both boys. They were sitting perfectly still now, but the air around them felt heavy, vibrating with a hum that lived in my molars. "Are you two okay?" I asked. They didn't answer immediately. They simply stared at me with eyes that seemed to hold a faint, ghostly afterimage of their own pupils. I realized then that they weren't just moving, they were being rendered by something slightly imperfect. Every time Silas breathed, his chest didn't just rise and fall, it briefly doubled, showing a second set of ribs beneath the first for the blink of an eye. It was as if they were caught in the transition between two moments of time. By midnight, the flickering became constant. The boys weren't solid anymore. When Silas walked across the deck, he left behind a faint trail of himself, a translucent shadow of where his arm had been just before it arrived at its destination. It looked like a watercolor painting that hadn't quite dried. I watched them play with wooden blocks on the floor. Every time a block fell, it didn't hit the wood with a single thud. It landed with a soft, muffled double tap. The sound was layered, like two notes played at once, but separated by a hair's breadth of air. I sat in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching them. They were becoming harder to track. Silas's face would suddenly widen into a geometric sprawl of features before snapping back into his handsome, boyish self. It was as if they were caught in the space between the tick and the tock of a clock. The boat felt smaller as the flicker intensified. The walls seemed to vibrate with the energy of their existence. I reached out to touch Silas's shoulder, but my hand passed through a momentary ghost of his skin, a shimmering, translucent overlap where he was half here and half there. He looked up at me, his hair shimmering like auras in the moonlight. Then came the moment of true clarity. The lake was a black mirror. Leo stood on the left side of the boat. Silas stood on the right. They both stopped moving entirely. The flickering reached a fever pitch, their bodies vibrating so fast they looked like hummingbirds made of flesh and bone. Their forms were overlapping, creating a strange, pulsing geometry. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. I realized that they weren't two separate boys anymore. They were beginning to merge into a single, complex shape of overlapping frames. They both turned their heads toward me at the exact same moment. The sound was a synchronized hum of vibrating air. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy like they were moving through honey. I looked at Leo, then at Silas, and then at the space between them where the air seemed to warp. My voice felt small in the vast, silent house. "Which of you is the real one?" I asked. The silence that followed was absolute. For 3 seconds, neither boy moved. Then, both of them spoke at once, their voices perfectly layered over each other like a choir of two. "We are," they whispered. As they said it, the flicker stopped. They became perfectly solid, perfectly still, and perfectly clear for one heartbeat. But then, Leo's face remained, while Silas's body vanished into thin air, leaving only his voice behind. The boy who was left stood in the center of the boat, his skin glowing with a faint, iridescent sheen. He didn't move toward me. He just waited. I reached out to touch his cheek, and my fingers met something that wasn't quite skin. It was slightly cooler than human flesh, vibrating with a constant, low-frequency pulse. I realized then that the flicker wasn't an accident of their bodies. It was the way they were being pulled into our world from somewhere else. They weren't just twins. They were two different versions of the same soul occupying the same space at slightly different speeds. I sat back down, my hands trembling as I finished this report. The boat is still. The lake is still. And the boy who remains sits perfectly still in the center of the galley, waiting for me to notice that his shadow is moving 3 seconds slower than he is. The extra room in the manuscript. I am a translator of old texts, tasked with rendering the archaic poetry of the labyrinthine codex into modern prose. It is an arduous job because the manuscript is stubborn. It refuses to be finished as if the ink knows its own boundaries. I have spent months sitting in my study, but lately, the physical space around me has begun to warp. My house used to be a modest bungalow of 4 rooms, kitchen, parlor, bedroom, and attic. Yet, For 3 weeks now, I have discovered a fifth room. It is not a room that was always there, nor did I build it. It simply appeared, tucked between the hallway and the pantry. It is a rectangular void of perfect stillness, roughly 12 feet long. To enter it is to step into a space where the air feels heavier, smelling faintly of old parchment and ozone. The walls are textured like hammered copper, and there is no furniture, only a single, high stool at the far end. I find myself retreating to it every evening, watching as the manuscript seems to grow more frantic on my desk, its words rearranging themselves into shapes that mimic the architecture of this new space. Yesterday, while translating a particularly dense stanza about the self that observes, I noticed something peculiar in the margin of page 84. A small note appeared in my own handwriting, though I hadn't written it yet. It read, "Who is watching from the copper room?" I looked up, and for the first time, I saw a figure sitting on the stool. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, it was a version of me, but rendered in slightly different hues. Its skin had the texture of polished mahogany, and instead of hair, a crown of iridescent filaments sprouted from its scalp like sea anemones. It didn't move when I first saw it. It simply sat there, holding a quill that looked like a shard of flint. I stood in the doorway, my breath hitching. "Are you me?" I whispered. The figure did not speak immediately. It waited until the silence became heavy enough to ache. Then it opened its mouth. Its voice was my own voice, but pitched a perfect octave lower, resonant and steady. "You are the one who speaks," it replied in my own tone. "I am the one who listens." As I moved closer, the manuscript on my desk began to vibrate. The ink started to bleed upward, defying gravity, forming a shimmering web of letters that hovered in the air between us. Every time I tried to move toward the figure, it would lean forward an inch. It wasn't just mimicking me, it was anticipating me. When I blinked, it blinked. When I took a step left, it shifted its weight to the right. It felt like dancing with a partner who knew your every move before you made them. By midnight, the room began to expand. The copper walls pushed outward, and the hallway outside seemed to stretch into an infinite corridor. The house was no longer a bungalow. It was becoming a gallery of these extra rooms, each one born from my subconscious. I realized that the manuscript wasn't just being translated, it was being built. Every word I put on paper birthed a new square of floor space. And in every new room, a new version of me appeared, each with different textures of skin and different crowns of filaments, all sitting on their respective stools. I reached out to touch the figure's hand. Its skin was warm, almost feverish. As our fingers met, I felt a jolt of recognition so sharp it made my teeth ache. It wasn't just a copy. It was the part of me that lived in the gaps between thoughts. The manuscript finally reached its final page. The ink surged one last time, turning into a deep, velvety black that swallowed the floor around us. The house fell silent. The extra room stopped expanding. I sat down on the floor beside my mahogany-skinned twin. We looked at each other for a long moment, and then it reached out and took my quill. It began to write the final word of the codex, its voice echoing in the rafters like a choir of one. "The end," it whispered. I felt a strange sensation of being pulled, as if the room were hungry. I looked at my own hands and saw them beginning to turn from flesh into polished mahogany. The figure on the stool stood up and stepped out of its room, walking into mine with a graceful, fluid motion. It didn't just replace me. It occupied my space so completely that I felt myself becoming the background. I realized then that the manuscript wasn't a record of a journey, but a blueprint for a replacement. I am no longer the one holding the quill. I am the copper wall, the heavy air, and the memory of the person who once sat here. The entity stood in the center of my room, its sea anemone hair swaying slightly as if underwater. It looked at the door, then back at the spot where I had just been standing. It took a deep breath, its chest expanding with a sound like a turning page. Then, it spoke one last time, using my voice to describe the feeling of becoming something new. "I am finally home," it said, and as it finished, I felt my consciousness sink into the floorboards, becoming the very foundation upon which it now stood. The hum of the third washer. I always thought of 3 a.m. as the hour of static, a time when the world held its breath between the exhale of yesterday and the inhale of tomorrow. That was why I chose this specific laundromat, a cavernous, fluorescent-lit bunker on the edge of town where the smell of lavender soap fought a losing battle against the humid scent of wet cotton. It was Tuesday, and the rhythmic thrum of the machines provided a mechanical heartbeat for my solitude. I sat on a plastic chair, watching my heavy wool blankets tumble in the dryer, when the hum began. It wasn't a mechanical sound, it was human. A soft, melodic vibration drifted from the far end of the row where only one machine was running. Someone was humming a lullaby. It was a specific, slightly uneven tune, the melody my mother used to whistle every night while tucking me in, the one I hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a decade. My heart gave a small, involuntary skip. There were no other customers in the entire building except for a tall, strange figure standing by the folding table. At first glance, the stranger looked like a sketch drawn by a child who hadn't quite mastered scale yet. It stood at a full adult height, but its limbs were disproportionately thick and rounded, almost like smooth river stones joined together. Its torso was barrel-shaped, and its face was dominated by a pair of oversized, protruding ears that twitched toward the sound of my own breathing. It wore a coat made of heavy, velvet fabric that seemed to swallow the light around it. The figure didn't move as it hummed, its mouth barely opening, yet the lullaby grew richer and more resonant with every passing second. I felt an odd pressure in my chest, the kind you feel when a memory suddenly becomes physical. I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sharp protest. "Do you know that song?" I asked, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous space. The figure stopped humming instantly. It didn't turn its head like a person would. Instead, its entire upper body rotated toward me with a soft, velvet whoosh. Its face was a marvel of crooked proportions, a nose that sat too high on its forehead and a wide, beaming mouth filled with teeth that looked like small, pearlescent pebbles. It didn't speak, but it took a step forward. Its gait was strange, a rolling motion rather than a walk, as if it were moving on a series of invisible wheels. As it drew closer, the hum returned, but this time it wasn't just coming from its throat. It seemed to vibrate out of the very fabric of its coat. I realized then that the figure wasn't just humming for me, it was mimicking the exact frequency of my own childhood home. The air grew colder, and the smell of lavender intensified until it was almost dizzying. The figure stopped 3 feet away from me. It reached out a hand that possessed 4 thick, pudgy digits instead of 5. It touched my shoulder, and for a moment, I felt the warmth of its skin. It was hot, like a stone left in the sun. "It is a beautiful melody," it whispered. The voice wasn't a human voice. It sounded like 2 stones grinding against each other underwater. Then, with a sudden, fluid grace, the figure did something unexpected. It leaned forward and pressed its forehead against mine. In that moment of contact, I didn't just hear the lullaby. I felt every memory associated with it, the warmth of the quilt, the smell of wood smoke, the feeling of being safe. The humming stopped completely. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. The figure pulled back and stood perfectly still, its oversized ears perking up as if listening to something far away. It took one more rolling step toward me, then reached into a pocket on its coat and pulled out a small, smooth marble of deep amber. It placed the marble in my palm. My fingers closed around it, and I felt a faint pulse beneath the surface of the stone. The figure began to retreat, moving backward with that same rolling gait until it reached the very back of the room. It didn't wave, it simply settled into a crouch, its barrel chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Then, as if on cue, it stood up one last time and delivered a final, soft hum, the closing note of my mother's song. It vanished into the shadows of the back row not by walking away, but by simply folding inward until it was no larger than a small stool. I sat back down in my chair, the amber marble still warm in my hand. The machines continued to whirl, and the fluorescent lights flickered once, casting long shadows across the linoleum. I realized then that while the figure was gone, the hum hadn't entirely disappeared. It was lingering in the corners of the room, waiting for me to move. I stood up to gather my laundry, but as I reached for the dryer handle, I noticed something on the floor where the figure had stood. It was a single, perfect footprint, not made by a foot, but by the rounded, stone-like shape of its hand, pressed into the dust. My breath hitched as I looked back at the empty space. The marble in my hand began to glow with a faint, rhythmic light, pulsing in time with the humming that was now coming from inside my own chest. The shedding cycle. I am currently standing in the middle of the Suds and Shimmer automatic tunnel, a massive, cavernous ribcage of steel and wet concrete. I shouldn't be here alone. Usually, cars move through in a steady stream, but tonight, the machinery hummed to life with a rhythmic, grinding groan that seemed to invite me inside. The lights are dim, casting amber pools onto the soapy floor. At my feet lies a laminated audio tour map, and I am currently listening to the narrator's voice, a smooth, slightly weary baritone, guiding me through the experience. Stop 1, the voice echoes through the speakers. The entrance of mists. The mist is thick here, smelling of citrus and wet pavement. I take a step forward, and the sound of my own boot hitting the ground is followed instantly by a secondary thump. It is faint, like a heartbeat against the floor. Thump thump, I turn around. Nothing but the shimmering walls. Stop 2, the narrator continues. The great scrub. The giant spinning brushes overhead rotate with agonizing slowness. As they move, the footsteps become more distinct. Every time my right foot lands, a second set of feet, slightly heavier and wetter than mine, hits the ground exactly 1 inch behind my heel. It is as if I am walking with a shadow that has weight. Stop 3, the voice says. The rinse. The water sprays from the ceiling in a rhythmic pulse. Each time it hits, I feel a presence. It isn't just the sound of footsteps anymore. There is a sensation of displacement, like a subtle breeze pushing against my shoulder blades. Stop 4, the narrator announces. The waxing room. This is where the geometry of the tunnel begins to warp. The walls are closer now, dripping with a viscous, clear liquid. I stop walking. The footsteps behind me stop instantly. It is perfectly synchronized. I hold my breath for 3 seconds. Stop 5, the voice whispers. The shedding. That was when it first appeared. In the center of the room stood a creature that looked like a peeled grape merged with a piece of driftwood. It was a hollow shell, roughly the size of a human, but its surface was textured like hardened honey. It had no face, only a series of ridges running down its back. This was one of the entities, the Molters. Stop 6, the narrator says. The Molter's path. I watch as the creature moves toward me. It doesn't walk. It glides with a wet, sliding motion. As it passes through a doorway, it leaves behind another hollow shell. This new copy is an exact replica of its previous form, but now it has a thin, translucent membrane stretched over its ridges like a drum skin. I realize then that the footsteps aren't just coming from one thing. Every time the entity moves into a new space, it sheds a part of its existence, leaving a hollow husk behind to occupy the vacuum. Stop 7, the voice drones. The echo chamber. I hear a flurry of movement. Behind me, the footsteps multiply. Thump thump, thump thump. There are 3 pairs of feet now. Each time the entity moves forward, it sheds another shell. They begin to pile up like discarded cocoons. These shells aren't just empty, they have weight. One falls over and rolls toward my left foot. I start to run. The narrator's voice becomes faster, more urgent. Stop 8, it cries. The gathering. As I sprint, the entity is shedding rapidly. It moves like a frantic weaver, casting off shells in every room it touches. Each shell is unique. One is ribbed like a pumpkin. Another is smooth as a river stone. A third has tiny, vestigial bumps that look like frozen bubbles. They clutter the floor, making my breathing heavy. I can hear the entity now, not just its footsteps, but its sound. It makes a soft, clicking noise, like a fingernail tapping on a porcelain cup. It is gaining on me. The shells are falling faster now, creating a forest of hollow forms around me. Stop 9, the narrator says, his voice cracking with a hint of panic. The final shedding. I reach the end of the tunnel. The entity is only a few feet away. It stands before me, its body pulsing with a soft, internal glow. Its skin looks like crumpled silk. It moves forward one final time. With a violent, wet pop, it sheds its entire outer layer. The shell hits the ground and shatters into dozens of tiny pieces. From inside that shell, the true entity emerges, a creature with a torso made of braided copper wire and a head shaped like a teardrop. It doesn't have eyes or a mouth. Instead, its face is covered in hundreds of tiny, vibrating cilia that twitch in unison. It stands perfectly still. The footsteps stop completely. The silence of the tunnel is absolute. Stop 10. The narrator whispers into my ear, though I am not sure if it is coming from the speaker or the creature itself. The Dweller. The entity reaches out with a limb that looks like a twisted vine and touches my forehead. The touch is cold, but not freezing. It feels like the temperature of a stone deep underground. I realize now why there were so many stops on the tour. Each stop was a room where something had died to make room for what comes next. The entity doesn't just move through the tunnel, it consumes the space, leaving its past behind as a trail of ghosts. I turn to look back at the long line of hollow shells stretching into the darkness. They're all perfectly still, yet they seem to be leaning toward me, as if they are waiting for their turn to be filled again. I take one step backward, and the entity mimics my move, its copper wire body shivering. I am no longer the observer. I am the newest room in the tunnel. The creature leans in close, its cilia vibrating against my skin, and I feel a tiny, sharp prick on my shoulder where it is beginning to peel my own skin back to start the next cycle. The Cartography of the Unseen wound. The observatory sat perched on the jagged spine of Mount Selim, a lonely crown of stone and brass piercing the clouds. At 3 a.m., the silence was heavy enough to feel like weight against my eardrums. I sat alone before the great refractor, the massive telescope humming with a low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate in my teeth. Outside, the air was thin and tasted of ozone. Inside, the scent was old oil and cold metal. My job was simple: watch the stars, record their shifts, and keep the gears turning. But tonight, the stars felt different, distant, like memories fading into a fog. I reached up to rub my temple and noticed a strange sensation on my left forearm. It wasn't a pain, but a texture, a ridge of raised skin that hadn't been there an hour ago. I pulled back my sleeve to see it. A jagged scar, roughly the size of a palm, textured like a topographical map of a river delta. The strangest part was that I had never fallen, never been cut by a blade, and never felt the sting of a healing wound. It simply appeared, silver and intricate, as if my skin were mourning an accident that had happened in a dream. As the clock struck 3:15 a.m., the hum of the telescope changed pitch. A rhythmic thudding began to echo from the gallery behind me. Asterisk thump. Drag. Thump. Asterisk, it wasn't coming from the wind or the shifting gears. It was deliberate. I turned my head toward the heavy oak door leading to the balcony. In the corner of the room, something moved. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by the rotating dome, but then the movement became independent. It emerged from the darkness, an entity that defied the logic of anatomy. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a smooth, iridescent sphere covered in tiny, vibrating scales that shimmered like oil on water. Its body was elongated, resembling a segmented reed, and it moved by crawling forward on 4 knees. These were not human knees. They were thick, bulbous joints that pointed outward at 90-degree angles, allowing the creature to move with a strange, lateral grace. It didn't walk so much as it unfolded itself across the floor. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The entity moved toward me, its knees clicking against the stone floor like ivory marbles. "Who is there?" I whispered, the sound of my own voice feeling small and fragile in the vast dome. It didn't answer with a voice, but as it drew closer, the scar on my arm began to pulse. It wasn't just silver anymore. It was glowing with a faint amber light. And then, the most unsettling thing happened. The scar started to move. A tiny fissure opened in the center of the mark, and out crawled a microscopic version of the creature, a miniature replica of the Niwalker. It scurried across my skin, its many joints clicking. The large entity stopped 3 feet from me. Its head sphere rotated slowly, and the scales rippled as if it were listening to my heartbeat. I realized then that it wasn't just a visitor. It was the source of the wound. The scar on my arm was a doorway, a physical anchor for this creature in our dimension. As it moved closer, the scar began to expand. It raced up my arm like a vine, branching out into smaller veins of silver light. Each new branch felt like a needle pricking my skin, but there was no blood, only the sensation of something being etched onto my soul. I watched as the large creature reached out with a limb that looked like a bundle of braided silk and touched the center of my scar. "Stay still," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to it or to myself. The creature's spearhead hummed, producing a sound like a distant cello string being plucked. Suddenly, the room felt colder. The stars outside seemed to lean inward, as if the mountain itself were bowing to the entity. The scar on my arm was now a massive web of silver lines covering my entire left side, reaching over my shoulder and down to my waist. It wasn't just a mark anymore, it was a landscape. I could feel the geography of it, the deep valleys of the larger scars and the sharp peaks of the smaller ones. The creature began to retreat, its knees pointing outward as it moved backward with effortless fluidity. It didn't disappear into the shadows. It simply folded itself into the center of my largest scar, shrinking until it was a tiny spark of light nestled against my skin. The hum faded, and the weight of the silence returned, heavier than before. I stood up, my muscles aching slightly as if I had just finished a long trek through a forest. The observatory felt smaller now, more intimate. I looked down at my arm, watching the silver lines settle into their permanent positions. I reached out to touch the scar one last time. It was still warm, vibrating with a faint, residual energy. I realized that the creature hadn't just visited me, it had mapped me. Every ridge and valley on my skin now corresponded to a part of its home world, a place I could see in my mind when I closed my eyes. But as I turned back toward the telescope, a new sensation washed over me. The scar wasn't finished growing. Just as I thought it would reach its limit, a tiny, microscopic thump echoed from inside my skin. A new fissure opened near my collarbone, and another set of knees began to click, pushing outward into the flesh. I realized with a jolt that the scar wasn't a static map, it was an expanding territory. The creature hadn't just left its mark on me, it had claimed me as its ground. I felt my skin stretch slightly, a dull ache blooming in my chest as the silver lines reached for my ribs. The entity wasn't just outside anymore, it was becoming part of my anatomy. I sat back down, watching the stars fade into the pre-dawn gray. The telescope continued to hum, but I hardly noticed it. My focus was entirely on my left side. The scar had reached my shoulder blade and was beginning to curl around my spine like a growing root. It felt as though something were living underneath my skin, rearranging my insides to fit its new architecture. I stood up one last time to close the heavy oak door, but I paused when I noticed a small movement near my collarbone. A tiny, microscopic head sphere, the same iridescent sphere of scales, poked out from the silver lines of the scar, blinking at me with a sense of recognition. It wasn't just a guest anymore, it was a resident. The observatory was finally quiet, but I knew that deep beneath my skin, something was still unfolding. The last screening of The Folded Word. The red velvet seats were rows of silent, expectant mouths, waiting to be fed by the flickering light of the projector. I was the only person left in the auditorium, a solitary observer in a cavernous space that usually hummed with the collective breath of 100 strangers. The film, a wordless, atmospheric piece about shifting tides, had just reached its final frame. The screen faded to a deep, matte black, and for a moment, the silence was so heavy it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums like water. I sat in the center row, my hands resting on my knees, watching the dust motes dance in the beam of the projector light before it finally clicked off. The sudden absence of sound was what woke me up to the first anomaly. I cleared my throat, a small, dry sound that traveled upward into the rafters. "Hello," I whispered. The word didn't just bounce back, it rippled. It returned from the balcony as hello, but it carried a strange, wet texture to it, as if the air itself had been dipped in oil. I frowned, my heart giving a rhythmic thump against my ribs. I stood up, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and took a step toward the front of the room. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice firmer this time. The echo returned instantly. It wasn't just, "Is anyone there?" It was, "I am waiting." I froze. I hadn't said the word waiting. The words had arrived from the back corner of the theater, where the shadows were thickest and pooled like spilled ink. I felt a prickle of electricity travel down my spine. I wasn't alone. I looked toward the source of the voice, but the rows of seats appeared empty at first glance. Then I saw it, a shape slumped in the very last row. It was a creature that looked as though it had been folded out of a sodden, discarded newspaper. Its body was a series of sharp creases and soft curves, its surface covered in dense columns of tiny, black text. It didn't have a solid skin. Instead, it had the texture of pulp and fiber. Where a face should be, 3 distinct faces were printed in ink, stacked vertically. They weren't static. The eyes on the top face blinked with a rhythmic, mechanical click, while the mouth on the middle face moved as if reciting a poem I couldn't hear. The bottom face was perpetually winking. "You are very loud," the creature said. Its voice didn't come from its throat. It vibrated out of the paper itself, like the hum of a cello string. I hadn't shouted loud. I had been thinking it, but I hadn't spoken it aloud. The creature unfolded itself, its limbs extending with the sound of crinkling parchment. It stood up, moving with a jerky, stuttering gait as if it were being animated by an invisible hand turning pages. As it moved toward me, the headlines on its torso shifted and rearranged themselves into new words. "I am the echo of what you hide," it declared. It stopped 3 seats away from me. It didn't have a head in the traditional sense. It was a cluster of folded corners that converged at a single point, topped with a fountain of ink-stained texture. When it moved, small flecks of wet paper drifted off its body like dandruff. I took a tentative step back. "What do you mean by hide?" I asked. "The words you swallow," the creature replied. The faces on its head shifted rapidly now. The top face narrowed into a scowl, while the bottom one opened wide to reveal a cavern of black ink. It was responding to my internal monologue again. Every time it spoke, it captured a thought I hadn't even voiced yet. It felt as though the creature was reading the script of my subconscious. The air began to smell of old library books and damp earth. "Are you hungry?" it asked. I realized then that the ink on its body was beginning to flow toward my direction, like a slow-motion tide. The text on its chest began to blur as if someone had rubbed their thumb over wet paint. "I am hungry for your verbs," it whispered. It took another step. The floor beneath its feet didn't just creak, it seemed to absorb the sound, turning the wood into a dull thud. I felt a strange sensation, a pulling feeling in my chest, as if something were trying to tug on my very thoughts. "Don't let me finish your sentence," it warned. I found myself nodding, unable to help it. The creature was growing larger, its paper body expanding as it absorbed the atmosphere of the room. The more it spoke, the more the theater seemed to shrink around us. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower. It wasn't just a physical growth, it was a linguistic expansion. "You are afraid," it said. I hadn't realized I was trembling. My breath hitched in my throat. "Fear is a heavy word," the creature continued, its paper skin rippling like a disturbed pond. "It takes up much room." It moved into my personal space. It didn't have hands so much as folded flaps of paper that tapered to sharp points. It reached out and touched my shoulder. Where it touched, I felt the sensation of being printed, a brief, searing heat followed by a coolness. "Stay still," it commanded. I held my breath. The faces on its head were moving so fast now they became a blur of ink and motion. It was no longer just an echo, it was becoming a mirror. Every time I blinked, the creature's text changed to reflect my heartbeat, my pulse, the very rhythm of my existence. "I will take your silence," it whispered, its voice now a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in my bones. It leaned in closer, the scent of wet pulp filling my nose. The ink from its faces began to drip onto my skin, not as liquid, but as tiny, microscopic letters that clung to my pores. I could feel them sinking into my flesh, becoming a part of me. "I will turn you into a story," it said. It opened its largest mouth, the middle face, and inhaled. It didn't take an air. It took in the sound of my own name as I thought it. For a second, the theater was perfectly silent. The projector hummed once more, casting a final, dying beam of light across the creature's wrinkled body. Then, the creature folded itself back into a compact square, its faces closing like heavy eyelids. It sat on the floor at my feet, no longer moving, no longer speaking. I stood there for a long time in the dark, listening to the absolute stillness of the room. When I finally moved to leave, I felt a weight on my heel, a small, folded scrap of paper that had fallen from its body. I picked it up and unfolded it with trembling fingers. On the scrap, in fresh, wet ink, were 3 words: "You're next." The sway of the still dancer. The desert was finally silent, and I lay in the sand with my mother's hand over mine, watching her face go slack as sleep claimed her. We were miles from the nearest road, tucked into a dry wash where the shadows felt heavy enough to touch. The heat had bled out of the air, replaced by a cool, velvet stillness that made our breathing sound like synchronized clockwork. Behind us, the massive rock slide that had collapsed during the day sat like a jagged ribcage of stone, shielding us from the wind. Just before we drifted off, she whispered, "I am so glad we found this spot." It was a simple piece, born of exhaustion and the safety of the sand. But as her eyes closed, I realized that, even in sleep, her body wasn't perfectly still. Her shoulders jerked every few seconds, reacting to something only she could feel. As the moon reached its peak, the silence became thick. That was when the swaying began in earnest. While my mother remained frozen, a shadow on the limestone wall opposite us started to move. It didn't just flicker, it flowed. The silhouette of a dancer moved with fluid grace, a sweeping arm arc, a dip of the torso, a pirouette of the hips, while the creature itself stood as rigid as a statue. I watched that shadow dance across the stone for an hour, a rhythmic ghost tracing the curves of the wash. Before the moon reached its zenith, we had been sitting in a state of high alert. The dancer was no longer just a shadow, it was becoming physical. It stood 3 paces from us, a tall figure draped in fabric that looked like woven copper wire. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense, just a series of horizontal ridges across its brow and a mouth shaped like a wide, permanent O. It held its arms out to the sides, perfectly motionless, yet its shadow on the wall was currently performing a frantic, spinning gallop. When we first noticed it, I had been trying to find my footing in the shifting silt. My mother had reached out to steady me, her hand warm and solid. Then, she pointed toward the rock slide. "Look," she said. We saw it for the first time, a figure standing in the gap of the stones. It was tall, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its torso, ending in wide, flat palms. It stood perfectly still, like a portrait caught in midair, but the shadow it cast on the limestone was swaying from side to side, as if caught in a breeze we couldn't feel. Backslash as the sun began to dip below the horizon, turning the sky into a bruised purple. I started to notice the strangeness of our surroundings. The rock slide hadn't just fallen, it had seemed to lean inward, as if welcoming us. My mother laughed at my confusion. "It was always like this," she said, her voice echoing slightly against the stones. "The rocks have been falling since you were a toddler." But I remembered the garden of our old house, flat, green, and sturdy. The desert felt new, yet she insisted it was our oldest memory. Then came the first true wrong turn in my memory. Just as the orange light hit the grit, my mother pulled a small, weathered locket from her pocket. "You loved this," she told me, pointing at the wash. I blinked. In my mind, I had always seen myself running through tall grass with a kite. But here, under her gaze, the image of the kite began to dissolve into an image of me sitting in this very wash, holding a smooth stone as if it were a diamond. The memory shifted like sand. "No," I whispered. "I remember the wind in the grass." She smiled, though her eyes remained fixed on the rocks. "The grass was a dream. The dust is the truth." It was at that moment of shifting memory that the first stone fell from the ledge above us. It didn't tumble. It plummeted with a heavy thud. I looked up and saw a tiny fracture in the rock, a hairline crack that seemed to pulse. Then came another, and another. The sound became a steady rhythm, thump, 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 as if the wash were taking a deep breath. Backslash then, the first real movement happened. The dancer moved from behind the rocks into our clearing. It didn't walk, it simply appeared, its copper wire skin shimmering in the fading light. It stood perfectly still, yet its shadow on the wall began to stretch and contract like a lung inhaling air. I felt a prickle of heat on my neck. The dancer's body was a sculpture of permanence, but its shadow was a riot of motion. Just before we sat down, I realized how far we had walked. My mother led me through the dunes, her stride confident and sure. We weren't lost. She knew exactly where the wash lay. But as I looked back at our footprints, they weren't in a straight line. They curved inward toward each other, as if we were being pulled by an invisible magnet toward the center of the desert. Finally, the very beginning, the moment it all started. It was the first time I saw my mother's face in this landscape. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the rock slide as if she were reading a map. "We are going home," she said. But as I looked at her, I realized that home wasn't the house with the green grass I remembered. It was this dry, dusty wash, and for some reason, my mother had always convinced me it was the only place we had ever been. Now, the shadow of the dancer detached itself from the wall and stepped toward us. It didn't move its limbs. Instead, its body stayed rooted in the sand while its shadow began to reach out like a grasping hand. My mother's eyes flew open, her pupils dilating until they were nearly black. She wasn't looking at the dancer anymore. She was looking at me. "Don't let it move," she whispered, her voice no longer a comfort but a command. The shadow touched my feet. The desert suddenly screamed with the sound of grinding stone, and I felt the sand begin to rise upward in perfect, concentric circles. My mother's hand tightened over mine, her grip becoming iron-strong, as if she were trying to anchor us both to the earth before it dissolved entirely. The dancer stood tall, its copper wires humming a low, vibrating note that rattled my teeth. Its shadow elongated until it swallowed our bodies, turning our silhouettes into flickering flickers of gray on the limestone. Then, with one final, violent jerk of its motionless head, the shadow's movement stopped. Silence returned, but it was no longer velvet. It was heavy and suffocating. I looked up to see my mother's face again, her expression shifting from peace to a terrifying, wide-eyed recognition. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of dry earth and ancient dust. "We are finally here," she whispered. I blinked, and the world tilted. The shadow reached out one last time, and I realized that the desert was finally silent, and I lay in the sand with my mother's hand over mine. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.